marginalized our communities of color. Jews are among those asking, what can we do? What can we do together with the Black community to address this? Hundreds of years of systematic bias cannot be undone overnight, but our text, Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, tells us it is not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either. We are sad that this work is so sorely needed, but we are heartened at the opportunity to strengthen understanding between the Black community and the Jewish community as part of the Jewish Federation's ongoing interfaith initiatives to stem hate. For more than 100 years, Jewish Federation's ability to care for the vulnerable, inspire young people to build a strong future, respond when crises strike, and cultivate shared responsibility has depended on the strength of the civil societies in which we live. It's just one reason we must address racial discrimination. More fundamentally, Jews know too well the price of persecution. It is our moral imperative not to be bystanders. Elie Wiesel once said, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. Tonight, we will learn how Jews and Blacks stood together in the past, and we will draw inspiration to broaden and build on the interfaith work Federation has begun with dear friends, many of whom are with us tonight. As we go forward, we may face uncomfortable moments, things we don't know about each other. We cannot be afraid to ask in good faith and friendship. We may discover differences or concerns. We must respect each other enough to address these. In the past, we have all suffered from labeling, misunderstanding, and even mistreatment between different ethnicities, races, and religions, not to mention different factions of the Jewish community. We can do better, and we must. Thank you all for joining in this journey. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Mark Klein of Monmouth Reform Temple and Jewish Federation's Chair of Interfaith Initiatives. And thank you, Rabbi, for putting this program together. And my sincere thanks to all of our panel members for being here and working to bring our communities together. Rabbi bkinzbrunner is president of the Rabbinic Association in the heart of New Jersey and director of Religious and Spiritual Services of the Wolf Campus for Senior Living. Reverend Ron Sparks, pastor of Bethel AME Church in Freehold. Ms. Keshia Thomas, a dedicated advocate for justice who came to prominence when, in 1996, at an anti-KKK protest, she ended up saving the life of a white supremacist. Pastor Semaj Vanzant Sr., senior pastor at Second Baptist Church in Asbury Park, and Pastor Kerwin Webb, associate pastor of youth and young adults at Second Baptist Church of Asbury Park and president of the Greater Red Bank branch of the NAACP. And now over to you, Rabbi Klein.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for being here. We don't have to imagine that there's a lot to talk about because we're living it in the news every day. And the difference, I think, today and over the last many years is something will happen and we'll hold marches and we'll hold rallies, then we'll go about our business until the next horrible thing happens. But now there's some staying power. And for those of us who have put ourselves really on the front line, it's wonderful to know that what we're doing now, people are listening to. And it's not always about agreeing. It is about listening to each other and respecting each other. And it will require us to find ourselves in places of discomfort because we can't grow if we always want to stay within certain barriers. And so asking the tough questions, hearing some of the tough information, we need to get past knee-jerk reactions where we don't know something or don't want to agree. And we need to go back to the remembrance that we're supposed to see human when we look into each other's eyes. We all come from the very same DNA, and the things that separate us, we've created, and we need to uncreate them. So I want to start tonight by saying we're all racists. Each one of us has biases. The goal isn't to try to deny who we are. The goal is to become anti-racist and to become pro-human. To get back to a place where we can celebrate God by celebrating each other, realizing that it's actually a line in the Quran that speaks it best, that God created each of us unique so that we could grow with every engagement. And sometimes that can be scary, but it's always an opportunity for blessing. The Black-Jewish relationship is not a new one. And it's amazing how many Jews and how many African Americans don't know that we have this huge relationship and commitment to each other throughout history. And there's reasons for that, which I'll get to in just a moment. But, you know, we'll go back to, in the South even, it was the white Jewish stores that were the first to welcome Black clientele. And certainly not all white Jewish stores, which is part of the issue, because there were a lot of whites that really, white Jews that really enjoyed being honorary white Protestants in the South. You know, they don't make waves. They let us worship here. They let us have a synagogue here. So don't say anything and it'll all be okay. But in not making waves and in not saying anything, we're not only not standing up for us, but we're not standing up for what's right. But there are some notable events that happened. 1929, Louis Isaac Jaffe, the editor for the Norfolk, Virginia Pilot, won a Pulitzer Prize for his denunciation of lynching and reactionary Harry Byrd political machine. Julius Rosenwald, who was the chairman of Sears Roebuck, built schools. African American children weren't welcome in white schools, and they needed schools. So the founder of Sears and Roebuck built them all over the South. And his daughter, Edith Stern from New Orleans, continued to contribute heavily into the civil rights causes throughout the movement. And yet small town South always felt kind of obliged to walk the party line. So you get major movement in Atlanta and New Orleans and in the larger cities in Jackson, where rabbis and synagogues were bombed for supporting the civil rights movement. But then you go back to some of the small towns where if you didn't toe the segregationist party line and you ran a restaurant, they just never picked up your laundry or never delivered your food, or the police made sure that looters showed up regularly, or, you know, the fire code, you never could pass a fire code to open your business. And there were white citizens councils that ran lots of small towns in the South. And so you get places where, like in a Kingstree, South Carolina, where a very proud Jewish community supported building a Black high school for those poor Black children that didn't have a high school, and built it for the Black children, and then got upset when the Black community said, why didn't you involve us in the conversation? You know, the very patronizing way of handling relationships. The North was better, but by no means strong. You had a state like New Jersey that voted not to ratify the 13th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution and only accepted them once it became mandated by national referendum. The Emancipation Proclamation abolished slavery in only the Confederate states, not in the northern states. And so while Juneteenth is a major holiday for Black America, as General Order 3 was read in Galveston, in Missouri, in Kentucky, in Delaware, in Maryland, slavery was still very legal and very active. And the Jewish communities were part of white America. You had people that stood out. You had there were rabbis that marched. There were the St. Augustine 16 rabbis and Al Borspan, alav shalom, blessed memory, went to march with Dr. King in 1964. and were all arrested. It was the largest mass arrest of rabbis in American history, all for just marching. And the St. Augustine and Jacksonville Jewish communities chastised these rabbis for making waves. My wife's rabbi growing up, Al Lillywald, went from Cleveland. Actually, he was actually in Jackson, Mississippi, and he was beat up within an inch of his life marching for civil rights. So there's a long history. The NAACP was formed in part by Jews. Kivy Kaplan, who is the person that the Reform Movement's Religious Action Center is named for, was president of the NAACP. The civil rights, several of the civil rights bills were signed in the offices of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. And while if you watch the movie Selma, there are no Jews in that movie involved. It was Abraham Joshua Heschel that walked arm in arm with Martin King across the Pettus Bridge. Heschel, who took a hiatus from the Jewish Theological Seminary to go lead prayers for civil rights, and ended up being arrested. And when the school wanted to know why he was arrested, if he was leading prayer for civil rights, the most famous line he said, "My legs were praying." He was marching. Very rich history, and I can go on and on that the Jews were part of the founding of the Urban League and the early labor unions that mandated that white America and black America should be treated equally. It was Ken Clark, a Jew, who formed the opinion around the 1954 decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, and the opinion that the sociological opinion that segregation placed the stamp of inferiority on black children. That's what won the day at the Supreme Court. The problem we've run into is that we've forgotten the people who dedicated their lives, gave their lives. Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, who were with James Chaney trying to register voters in Mississippi, and they ended up killed and burned. It's the movie Mississippi Burning. We've forgotten all that because when Dr. King was assassinated, and then 4 years later when his dear partner, Abraham Joshua Heschel, passed away, there weren't people who had been groomed to step up and to continue to lead this movement together. And at the very same time, you have a white Jewish America that was starting to find its way into access to white world. The meritocracy, if we worked hard enough, we could find ourselves breaking those barriers. In the 60s and early 70s, to have a social life as a Jew, especially in the South, you had to be a member of a synagogue or you weren't welcome anywhere. Well, that changed. It did not change for Black America. And the Black Power movement became very strong, and Jews tried to hold on to the Black Power movement as talking about Russian Jewry, and there was some resentment that while we were advancing in the real world, we were trying to still hold on to someone else's coattails and yoke that power. While the early civil rights movement was tied in time to the end of Nazi Germany, and Heschel and Joachim Prinz and many of the rabbis who were leaders were actually saved from the Shoah and could speak of the horrors of Nazi Germany. Further down the road, it's further removed. And when white people, I've heard several friends when they go to Jewish Seder, several African Americans, they go to Jewish Seders, and we say, we know what it's like to be oppressed because we were slaves in Egypt. I'm not sure what that really means, especially if you read the Torah, because we were slaves, which meant we were able to borrow the gold and the jewels from Egypt as we were leaving. And they're longing for the return to pheasant while they're wandering through the wilderness. So slavery in the Bible is very different than what we've experienced in American culture. So the sociology and I think the lack of sensitivity and lack of understanding has driven this schism between our people. And I think the last piece that I'd want to address in terms of what has happened is that there's a schism within the Jewish world. Liberal Judaism understands tikkun olam, letakein et ha'olam, to repair the world, as the cornerstone of everything Jewish. Deuteronomy says, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue it. And the prophets speak about pursuing that, the cause of healing the whole world. And the Jewish concept of the Messianic age involves peace for everybody, not just for some people. And that's wonderful, but there's a part of the more traditional Jewish world that understands those calls to be about their relationship with other Jews. So in some parts of the fundamentalist Jewish world, when it says you can't stand by while your neighbor bleeds, it means your Jewish neighbor. And whatever happens to somebody else. And tied to that is, I think, the sense of the loss of awe. A lot of the liberal religious world has lost the sense of awe. And we are rational secularists that use the word God. And when we stand in a sense of awe, Dalif Nemi, know before whom you stand, it's easy at that point to look into every one of our neighbor's eyes and see God staring back. But when it's dotting I's and crossing T's and there's a rationalism to it, we forget about what should be our empathy for each other. And so that's a nutshell version of our history together and what I think has gone wrong. Over the last 30 years, we've worked hard to rebuild some of these ties. In 1999, I was working with the late W.D. Muhammad, the son of Elijah Muhammad, who took the Nation of Islam into a true Muslim state of peace, which separated them from Louis Farrakhan. And W.D. Muhammad, Warthin, said to me that his goal as a Muslim and as a Black American was to find a way that we could all recognize each other's humanity. And that's where we came together. We've had 30 years where we haven't quite, all figured this out. But now I think we're on the precipice of some major movement forward. So before I introduce Keshia, I'd say Kerwin Webb said, as we were gathering, Kerwin said, finally, it looks like we're actually moving forward and doing something. And that's why we're all together. There's a lot of trust that we're building with each other, where we can have the challenging conversations and know that we love each other unconditionally. And I think that's, if I may, that's where I'd like to begin all the rest of the commentaries. So I'd like to ask Keshia to unmute. I met Keshia Thomas several years back, marching across Georgia as part of the Journey for Justice. From Selma to Washington, D.C., we were carrying a Torah scroll. And Keshia met probably 100 Reform rabbis over the course of that 1,000-mile journey. But we became close friends. And then I got to see her again on the last day as I helped carry the Torah scroll up to the steps of Lincoln Memorial. Keshia's prominence, while she was a teenager in Detroit, she was attending a KKK rally and ended up saving the life of a white supremacist. And she understood that it wasn't about winning, it was about justice and healing. So with that, Keshia, if you will, take the stage.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that in-depth educational history of the Jewish and Black relations. And we have to keep this history, even if it's oral, going so people understand that it just didn't start yesterday. It started in the time before. Like I said, when nobody was giving us loans, Jews were giving Black people loans. So I'm greatly appreciative. Right now, if anybody knows me, they know that my eye is not where the ball's at, but where the ball is going to be. And everything that we have done in the past is a stepping stone to where we have to go. I can't tell you the emotional toll it takes on an activist to hear and see and witness over and over again death and police shootings and killings. On top of that, urban shootings and killings, something that we don't really talk about. And it's frustrating. And we always ask ourselves, okay, well, what do we need to do? What can we do? When I was a kid, I'm just gonna sidetrack here. When I was a kid, I used to love Fraggle Rock. And I never understood why these little Fraggles would work on this construction site and all these other big monsters would come and eat it, but they would still continue every day, get up, put their shoes on, and go and rebuild what was destroyed the day before. And that was a lesson in life. Things are going to be destroyed, things are going to be broken down, but you have to get up, get going, and never, ever, ever give up. As frustrating as it is, you want to stop and you want to give up, but we cannot, because we have another generation of young people that are coming up behind us that are looking to us for leadership. They're looking to us for answers in a better way. So let me digress a little bit. As we look to where the ball is in the future, if you will, on what we have to do. We've marched, right, Mark? You and I, we marched, what, 1,009 miles total with everybody that was there for Zedek, for justice. That's the Hebrew word for justice. And to see, again, like more and more police killings, we ask ourselves, is marching effective? Is that what's going to change the tide? Then it goes a little deeper. You know, I'm on the street corner and I'm talking to these guys. And then it's like, okay, is voting effective? I remember I was up here and I opened up a small little restaurant instead of a gas station in my neighborhood because we live in a food desert. Racism, if I could, is not just the police against the people, if I will. It's a set of everything that we don't get access to. We don't get access to fair education. We don't get access to good quality food. We don't get access to resources. We don't get access to programs. We don't get access to any of those things. Where I live at right now, they spent millions of dollars building a skate park and a bike park. And then when I went to the city and I said, okay, well, what about a community center for these kids that are experimenting with drugs? And everybody that knows, well, once you experiment, it's almost like a gateway, if you will, to that life. It's frustrating, Mark, because the tip of the iceberg is the police. That's the tip. That's when they're called, right? So as I'm driving here to get to this meeting right now, the corner store, if you guys ever watch my Facebook lives, I do a lot of lives from there, I see 10 sheriffs clamming down on a group of Black kids that don't have access to fair education, because in our America, education, your good education depends on how much money your parents have and can pay for taxes. So if we want to start changing that, let's start saying it doesn't matter how much money your parents have to pay for taxes. As a state, that money should be spread across every kid equally. But racism is it's that line. It's that you live over here, I live over there, that line, right? So what we have to start doing is breaking down that line and saying, you know what? That line was from generations before. We marched and did that whatnot. Now we control who's in office and we can say, no more, that line is not there. So now these kids that didn't have the same dollars that the rich kids in the Woodlands have, the same opportunity, we can erase those lines and start erasing that racism. But because you have to understand, you're talking about police killings and shootings. By the time the police come, and let me be very careful here because you have to understand what I'm saying. We don't, or I don't, and in our community, we do not like to call the police. We do not trust the police. We do not have a relationship with the police. The sheriffs, I see them for face value of what they are and what they've done. Now, let me digress a little bit. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ann Arbor is a very wealthy area. It's the University of Michigan. It's Big Ten football. It is opportunity. It is everything you've ever wanted. You could have it growing up in Ann Arbor. We went to Ann Arbor Public Schools, which is top schools in the country. Now, not to say that there were not some communities that were poor and of color that didn't get the same access. But I grew up in a Cosby type of world. So when I came to Northborough, in the back of my mind, honestly, I still thought, okay, well, you know what? The police are wrong because of what I experienced in 92 with Rodney King, but they can't all be that wrong. But when you live in the urban area, when you see the injustice, and on top of that, when you experience it, and you know that there is nothing that you can do, it's either, and let me tell you, I don't know how deep we're gonna have this conversation today, or how far you want me to go, but when they arrest you in Northborough, when they arrest you in poor communities across the country, they're not giving you the chance for justice. You either plead, take a deal, which means you admit that you're guilty, even if you're not, because you just want to get out of the system. But then you have to go back to court, back to, to doing community service, back to paying them, and back on a record. So the system is not set up anywhere near fair for justice. So yes, the racism that Black Lives Matter is touching on is the tip of the iceberg. It is I'm talking, like when you're in a swing and it goes all the way up, that's where the racism is that Black Lives Matter is touching. When you come back down, you're not talking about the inadequate education that the police are getting. You're not talking about the fact that police officers who have a record or have complaints can get fired from one place and just easily be picked up at another department and then back on the streets to manage or police a minority community. Then let's come back down to the fact that these kids that are on the corner, once you arrest them, whether they are right or wrong, they took the plea and now you have labeled them for life. It is a whole problem with the justice system. And then let's swing that swing back down where you have mayors like the mayor of Houston, who's a Democrat, who's all of the people in city council are Democrat, and they just gave more money to the police than they put back into community service and education. So these are this came from a Black man. So we're not just dealing with racism from police officers and the Klan or racism you see. We're dealing with racism inside of Black people. We call that colonization. I don't know how real you want me to get, but you're dealing with people that don't believe that the investment. Let me tell you something, Mark. When I got the opportunity to experience Jewish culture, Jewish life, Jewish families, there was a lot of Jewish people that I was able to go to their homes and go and stay overnight and speak at their synagogues and talk at their universities. But one of the things that I loved the most was the investment that every Jewish family I had ever visited put into their kids. Mark, when I met you, your daughter was on her way to Ohio State, the Ojai, right? She got the opportunity to be invested in. I didn't say anything about Michigan, even though I wanted to. I really wanted to be like, girl, you sure you don't want to go to U of M? But I kept it to myself because I was like, oh, Mark's gonna kill me. But you all invest in your kids because you know that your kids, if you have to sum up what Jewish culture is to me from the outside, Jewish culture is not just a religion. It's about how you treat family. It is about a culture of family, heritage, and tradition. And in this family structure, the tradition is the families are set up to sacrifice for the next generation, to set it better for the next generation. That's not just from your kids, but that's to the Jewish camps that are set up as well. So even if every kid in the Jewish culture doesn't have a lot of money, they can all go to camp and experience this Jewish culture. Black kids.
Can I give you like the 30-second warning so we can?
Oh, no, please, by all means. I digress.
No, go ahead, finish up your point, but I just want everyone to have enough time to.
I just want to say this. That if there's one thing that I want to pull from from Jewish culture. If I want to snatch out and duplicate and put that in Black culture, if we are going to give our kids a future, is to understand that the future is theirs. Everything that we do must be an investment into them, not into business, not into the police, into their education, into their hopes, into their dreams, into their progress. That's one thing that Jewish culture has done that Black people, because of racism and systematic racism, has not allowed us to do. Our kids are handicapped by the time they're in 3rd grade. If you get a kid that has been expelled, they're already building prisons based on the statistics in that number. So if you want to help us duplicate what you guys are already doing for your own kids. Give them a future that they can believe in.
And Keshia, I appreciate that. Systemic racism is way beyond what most of us understand, and it does impact at every level. Some of the things that we take for granted are not available just because it's not on our radar. We had a conversation last night with chiefs of police, and one of the questions that was raised is, why don't we have more diverse police forces? And Terrence Porter said, well, because some of the kids who might be great police officers are already in jail. And so, there's things that just we don't understand. So I appreciate the perspective of understanding it's not even about police brutality, it's about what happens that warrants the ugliness to begin with. So with that, my long-term friend, partner, brother from another mother, Semaj Vanzant and I have found our way into each other's company in incredible blessed situations, and he is the senior pastor at Second Baptist Church in Asbury Park. And dear friend Semaj, take it away.
Yes, well, good evening to everyone, and thank you to the Jewish Federation in the heart of New Jersey, and to all others. Mark, definitely for the invitation, and Dan, who I'm just getting to know. So I am really just appreciative of this opportunity. And Keshia, thank you for the insight that you were offering. One of the things that, as I was listening to Mark talk about the history of the Jewish and Black relationship, and also the area or the time in which it's split, I really began to think about how now that, because one of the things that you said, Mark, was that there was, that there were many Jews who decided to, to assimilate right into the white America. And I'm thinking now, as we look about going forward, how awesome would it be to use the leverage, the backing, the power and things, to use it all to being a strong ally for Black America in all of its forms. And I think, and I stand with Keshia on the education portion of what she said. I really think that in many ways, Black America has a lot to learn from our Jewish brothers and sisters, and the ways that they, and I heard you talk about a schism, but there's a for the most part, a unified front, right, of Jews towards any type of anti-Semitism and towards them. And my hope is that Black America can learn from that and say that we stand united against it. Not if, for the fact that we would learn, not that it would benefit us personally, but that it would benefit the whole. One of the things that I think is, I love Mark's opening statement. He said that we're all racist, right? Racist, CES. And I think in some ways, we have in us some racism, and I think we have to work to eradicate that. And one of the ways I try to distinguish that is to, instead of saying, let's work to be anti-racist, let's work to be anti-biased, right? Because sometimes anti-racist can give off the connotation that, we're trying to eradicate the differences and the beauty of our variation. But anti-bias helps us, and to emphasizes the point that I cherish and appreciate who you are that is different from me. I just do not see your difference as deficient. And so, I definitely think when that is our mindset, right, that we don't see each other as that we appreciate the difference, but not see each other as deficient, then I really think that we, standing strong in a place where we can strongly get to the place where we can stand together in unity and really eradicate this sin and this perversion of humanity that exists within this country and even around the world. One of the scriptures that I'll think about two. One is, of course, the Psalm 133:1, which says, behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity. Then there's also another one in Colossians 3:14 that says, and above all, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And when I think about, what is it that will help us get to a place that we, where all of us can be seen in the Imago Dei, the image of God, where I can see that in you and you can see that in me, despite my culture, despite my race, despite my ethnicity. I really believe it's that when we put on love, right? And love says that your needs, that my needs rather, become invisible to your needs. And when I begin to love you, and you begin to love me, your concern is how can I make sure that you're taken care of, and my concern is how can I make sure that you're taken care of? How can we all make sure that we are receiving the same amount of value, the same appreciation, the same amount of respect that we all deserve as those who created and created in the image of God? How do we do that? And I really believe it. The answer falls on love that will generate unity. One of the things too that I also just want to say is that this relationship is vital, right? The relationship between Black Americans and our Jewish brothers and sisters is vital, that we cannot neglect it. In the places where it is neglected, we need to speak to it and call attention to it and make a connection. And in places like this, right, where we do see this relationship forming and developing, and yes, Mark is my brother from another mother. When we can have those type of relationships and that bond, then I believe that we together become a force that will root out everything that is against God's creation. And so I just really think that is our key, right? My key is, my point is to see you as God's creation, and you to see me as such, and then for us to address those who do not, right? And to speak up in conversations when there's disrespect, and when there is disrespect of the other, that we speak up, and then also in places where there are policies and procedures and laws that are not fair across the board, then we need to do that. And so then we need to speak up and say that this is not right, and here's how we're going to correct it. But so lastly, in closing, not to go over my time, just to say that, I need you and you need me. And if we love each other the way that we love ourselves, then I really believe that we can begin to take this wind that is already blowing in the right direction and cause it to be a wind tunnel, and really knock down every obstacle and every barrier and everything and every person who would get in the way of us all being seen as equal, valuing our differences and cherishing the diversity that God has amongst us, so that we can all dwell together in unity. For surely that is what is good and what is pleasant. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, I can see the new the T-shirt, "Wind Tunnels for Peace."
Love it, love it.
I'd like to ask Kerwin Webb to speak next. Kerwin is youth pastor at Second Baptist, but he's also the president of Red Bank's chapter of the NAACP. And as I'm telling the whole world, if you want to see what the future leadership of America looks like, you're about to hear from him. So, Kerwin, you're muted.
Thank you, Mark. You're too kind for your words. I appreciate the invitation. Dan, Susan, the entire Jewish Federation, all those who are listening, thank you for being here for this important conversation. As I heard, Mark, the resuscitation of the history, and as I heard Keshia and Semaj talk, while I'm agreeing with all of that, there's a part of me that says that we, as African Americans, as Black people, have a bigger role to play than we are letting on. So I'm not denying white supremacy. I'm not denying the structural systemic racism, but we in our institutions, in our organizations, in our homes, and our families do not have to subscribe to the beliefs of the dominant culture that is oppressing us. But too often you go to places and you see that we are mimicking the same behaviors, just basically stepping on somebody else within our, in our community who we see as less than as well. I think Mark's comment about we're all racist, Semaj said races, E-S, racists. We all have racism in us because we've been shaped and cultured in a way to believe the narrative. I don't think there's ever been a disconnect between Jews and Black people. I think the ones that we can highlight and push for media narrative and all of that, yeah, that might have gone away. But I don't think that people of goodwill, I don't think that people who are of conscience and faith will look at the differences in race and use that as a reason to not work together. I think humans, people, we are flawed and egotistical and arrogant and all of those things. So we choose to be offended and don't work together. I wouldn't say that's a systematic breakdown. I think that's a human condition. So what I see as going forward, what I think the future needs to be, Keshia is doing some amazing work. Semaj is doing some amazing work. Mark is doing some amazing work. And this is a generalization. I hate them, but I'm gonna use it. Jews are generally good at working together, better than Black people. So we can look at that, we can learn from that, but also we as Blacks, Jews, and other oppressed peoples, we also need to look at cooperative economics, right? Our system, the capitalistic system, is built on greed and all of that. So if you take the profit motive out of what's happening, you begin to shock the system and you can create a new reality. We are not enslaved to this ideology. We are not enslaved to this mindset. We just have to be courageous enough and bold enough to step out and say, I demand something different, and then go and do it. If we combine our gifts, our talents, our skills, our resources, our opportunities, then we all can create a new reality that the world will look at. We are too busy trying to fit into the systems and play nice with people so I don't hurt your feelings. And you know what? It's time out for that, okay? Here's what I see. We're at a flashpoint in history. We're at a major milestone. Let's not let anybody fool you. All Black people were not in support of the civil rights movement. All Black people were not in support of Martin King. All Jews are not in support of equal rights. So we can understand that there are people that are not gonna agree. forget them. Let's focus on the ones who are, and let's look at innovative ways to impact our systems. Stop asking these politicians who are bought off to do stuff. Let's do it and force their hand. It's all about what we are doing. And that's why, Mark, when I got on here, I said, I'm glad we're finally doing something because I'm fed up with talking. So I will close with this. I'm so excited to be the president of the Red Bank Area NAACP, but I'm more proud to be a Black man because we are making history now. And what we do from here on out, history will record our names and what we do. So get on the right side because I would not want to be a George Wallace or Bull Connor because history doesn't record us kindly. Thank you for listening.
You got me unmuting my mic. Go ahead, boy. Go ahead.
Mark, you're muted. You're muted.
Mark, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, that was excellent. Excellent.
So you talk about the human condition, and it's not just on racism. It's about the many places where we fail. My predecessor, several rabbis, my emerita right now, Rabbi Sally Present, 1972, broke the ceiling, was the first ordained rabbi in America. And it was in 1999 that Alyssa Stanton became the first African-American female to be ordained as rabbi in America. So it's late in the history of our tradition that we finally let some of those ceilings break as well. So the human condition, we've all got lots of work to do. Next, I'd like to ask Orthodox Rabbi Brian Kinsbrunner, who I met on a trip to Israel several years back. And we realized that while we don't see tradition much in the same way, we see humanity in absolutely the same way and have become very, very close friends. So Brian?
Oh, thank you, Mark. I'm not sure I have much to say. I have to thank everybody who spoke before because I think you have really proven what I was going to really share, which is, I think first and foremost, in my opinion, it's really is about this building relationship, and it's speaking to the vulnerabilities, and it's speaking to the complications, and it's teaching lessons every day. I'm going to try to be brief, and I'm going to start with the following. I'm going to reiterate Mark's point from the very beginning, because I think that if we can be honest with ourselves and say those words that we have our biases, we have our racism, we have our preconceived notions, and they're very hard to get rid of no matter how much work we do, we've already won half the battle. So I work in healthcare chaplaincy. I work at a senior care center. I do a lot of hospice work. And hospice work really gets you to the core of humanity. It puts you in front of people of all races, cultures, religions, socioeconomic strata, et cetera, et cetera. And in order to do that, it forces, in chaplaincy at the very least, it forces us to confront our triggers. Confront the things that, if you will, put barriers up when we even walk into a room. And throughout our lives, professional lives, and really personal lives, because it really overlaps, we're always continuing to grow and check those triggers. One of the requirements of chaplaincy for those that are board certified chaplains, in addition to their training, is peer review every couple of years of checking in with your colleagues, of having conversations, of reviewing work you've done, and perhaps finding new triggers, things you didn't even realize were causing you to have a barrier with somebody. The reason I share all that is I believe that a lot of the struggles over the past, the struggles that continue in the relationships in the Black and Jewish community that we haven't raised as much, but some of the splits that have occurred and some of the rhetoric that's been shared on both sides of the aisle are those triggers that have often kind of kept us apart. And they're going to be there. And I think that some of those things are going to be there because we're not having these conversations. So we're not really saying, okay, what's really behind the thoughts, whether it's the change, the issues of, our opportunity or not opportunity, issues of how we relate to other injustices in the world and as a whole. If we want to talk about Israel, Palestine, when we talk about all of those topics, there's a lot of hurt and there's a lot of challenge, and there are a lot of words that have been said. But do we know who said them, when they were said, were they apologized for, were they not apologized for, were they rethought about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We don't always get those opportunities to have the first conversation because we hear it and we shut down. Now, just to kind of put my Orthodox part of my hat, my Orthodox rabbi hat on for a moment, there's always this challenge of the balance of what one believes to be tradition and confronting the world as that we live in. At least in the Orthodoxy that I come from, which is a much more modern kind of Orthodoxy, which is sort of where both really do have a role and a value. And of course, the question is which comes first and which comes second. I only share that because I think that very much can often play into the challenge. How much universalism do we have versus how much particularism do we have? When do we defend our own? When do we defend everybody else? Right? We talk about flashpoints, we talk about moments. Sometimes they can be complicated. And again, that may be the biases that we bring to the table, but those are the biases that have to be heard too. And I think that when we can get together like this and be honest and be vulnerable and speak to those triggers, we've already walked a path further than we may have ever walked before. And so that's why I think that this is very important. Mark had raised a couple questions to us in advance, and he had talked about what would be modes of healing. And I just want to take a moment to just reflect on my notes on that part, and then I will conclude, because I think that my voice in this, I'm humbled because I don't do a lot of this work. I do a lot of, day-to-day work with people. So I don't do a lot of the broader work. So I really am speaking from observation more than from involvement. But to me, when I think about healing rifts or healing relationships or moving forward or taking or doing more, it's first and foremost these conversations. It's learning more about each other. It's filling in those gaps about each other. And I think it goes across the board. And forgive me for saying it, but I'm still amazed that if you go on, maybe not today, but if you went on Amazon last week, and you went to search for, there was the top 10 books to better educate us on Black Lives Matter, racism, et cetera, they were all sold out because people are trying to educate and trying to read. And I think there's such a value in learning more, not coming to people and just saying, okay, tell me your story. That's obviously the most important, that can be very important, but learning about each other, deepening that part of the relationship as well. And I think that these conversations help that along because we hear those points. So thank you for the opportunity to say a few words as well. I hope that I've kind of given a little bit of my perspective on this, sort of an outsider looking in a way to this topic. And I'll turn it back to Mark.
Brian, thank you so much for that. The healing piece is so important, and the quest for education. One of the reasons that I want to have these conversations is I tire, and I know I speak for my colleagues, when they say, well, teach me. And I don't know why we should have to go to Black America to be taught how to be human. That's something that we should know and we should understand. And it comes from recognizing, that humanity begins as one DNA. We don't understand each other, and it yields some really strange questions that we have to field that don't make sense. There's a saying in our tradition: "Your ears hear what your mouth is saying," and you play some of the stuff back, it's just crazy. So I'm going to ask as our last speaker, Pastor Ron Sparks of Bethel and Freehold. He and I came together through a couple of there's no such thing as serendipity. Einstein said coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. and shared just an incredible friendship, and I've learned a great deal from him. So Ron, if you'll bring us home.
Thank you, Mark, and to Susan and the Jewish Federation. We thank you for this time and opportunity. Keshia, Semaj, Kerwin, and the rabbi have said so much already. One of the things that I look back on as I listen to them and I look at our situation, I think back on how I met Rabbi Mark Klein. We so easily call him Mark that I sometimes forget he is a rabbi, but just because of the kind of person he is, that titles aren't important to him, but relationships are. And one of the statements he made when I first met him, we talked about what it means to say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and then love your neighbor as yourself. And he went on to explain it from a Hebrew context that God loves us for the worst that's in us. And because he loves us for the worst that's in us, he accepts us for who we are. So therefore he turned it around and said, so me as your neighbor, I must love you for the worst that's in you. And because I love you for the worst that's in you, there's whatever you do, because of my faith in the God that I love, that I will love you beyond the worst thing that you can do. And without faith, it's hard to do that. Without entrusting in a God that you serve, it's hard to do that based on our own ability. And as Pastor Semaj was talking about that love, it's not just that kind of love that from a pulpit and from a church perspective that we talk about love, but it's the everyday interaction that we never may mention the scripture. We never mention the person or the God that we serve, but because of what's in us, because of the actions that we take and the words that we say. And from that point, I invited Mark to my congregation on a Sunday morning to have words to, I call it preach, but he didn't want to call it that. But he opened up a lot of eyes to see, and I would tell them, Mark is unlike anybody I've ever met, and probably knows more Black history than many of our Black persons that's in my congregation, including myself. And so in coming to this meeting, it allows me to understand there's all something about us that's important. And it's looking beyond the differences, and it's looking beyond the anger and frustration. And when the protests are over and we try to affect policy, the net is we have to go back home. And we have to live in our neighborhoods, and we have to deal with schools. And as you guys were talking, and I have to admit, Keshia, I'm an Ohio State fan, so when you brought up Michigan, it's hard. But
Well,
even when you think about where our kids go to school, it's a struggle for a parent who wants to do the best for their children and get the best education they can. And when you have some choice, but you recognize that in making your choice, there's some ramifications for the choice that you make. So if I decide I want my kids to go to a better school, it's usually not in a neighborhood where people look like you and I. But on the same time, they're not gonna really understand who they are, because we end up becoming a part of the system that says, I'm looking out for me, but I'm not looking out for the whole. And I struggle with that. My wife and I struggle with that. And many have to struggle with the education process. And we talk about the talk that we have to have with our kids as persons of color. We talk about the ramifications for everything that we do, that we have to be the tops at everything, and in order to get promoted, in order to graduate in the higher levels, in order to get to the college that you want to get to. And so these things, as a parent of two Black sons and a Black daughter, we're challenged. And as many, I think it was Semaj talked about, and Keshia talked about our neighborhoods and what they look like, and the people we associate with, and the stigmatism that goes with all of that. And that's why it's important for us to have this dialogue. because we have to understand that the choices we make have ramifications. Even on this call, there are ramifications for you being on this call. I think I've been on more Zoom conference calls about race and how to have dialogue and what do we need to do. I've been asked that question more than I've ever thought I've ever would ask that question. What do we need to do? And the reality is, as Mark always talks about, look at us for human, that being human, because we all want the same things. We want to educate our kids. We want to grow up in an environment where we feel safe. We want our kids to get a good education. We want them to be able to have some kind of career, to make something of themselves, and then reproduce and have children and to be able to be comfortable. But we've come to understand that's not necessarily what's going to happen. You can check all the right boxes and you can do all the right things, but there's something about skin color, there's something about lack of understanding that changes. And Keshia talked about being frustrated, and does protesting and marching work, does voting work when we assimilate into a system where we have these moments and then the moments pass. But we have to look at things not just individually, but for the greater whole. And to have this kind of conversation and to be able to be uncomfortable and to see the heart of people. I think in many African-American Black folks, you hear a tiredness in the voice sometimes because we have to have these conversations over and over and over again. And depending on who got shot, when they got shot, how long the protests last, and then we go back to business as usual. But we never deal with the redlining in our communities. We never deal with the gentrification. We never deal with the, as Keshia brought up, the education system, the school to pipeline, prison into prisons. We don't deal with the everyday activity of persons of color have to deal with on a daily basis, because once we've had our marches and have our conversation, and once people get a few programs and get some money for something, we no longer have the same kind of zeal. So I appreciate Kerwin because of his energy, and Keshia for her energy, and you know, we rely on that energy to keep us going, but at the same time we need other voices to look beyond skin color. The one thing that I noticed, and I didn't have a lot of interaction with the Jewish community until I moved to New Jersey, and one of the first encounters I had was with my dentist. I had a Jewish dentist, and what I noticed was if I did the cleaning and all of that, it was one place, but if I needed to get specialty work, they referred, and it usually was to another Jewish dentist or surgeon, and they kept it going around into the community. We talked about us learning from our Jewish brothers and sisters of how when the door is open for us, we tend to close it because we don't want anybody else to come in, rather than holding the door open and getting as many people in as we possibly can. And so on one hand, it can be frustrating, but on the other hand, it's exciting that we're in a time that we can make a difference. But it's a matter of what we're willing to do to make that difference, and how we're willing to come together to make that difference. So thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for allowing us to express who we are. But most importantly, as you get to know us, let us get to know you so that we can love you for the worst that you are, just as God does to us.
Thanks, Ron. Thank you so much. Dan?
Thank you, everybody. We have some good questions, so I'll get right to it. This is a little long, but it's actually a very important question. This is Shelly, and she's saying the following. I've been talking with folks about relationships between police and youth. For example, there is at least one officer in our area who's dedicated to establishing a relationship with students. I'm hoping that a culture of police versus citizens can be one of the proactive things that can be done to improve, I guess, the situation. I think that's what Shelley was trying to ask, and she can jump in if I'm wrong. But do either of you or any of you think that that's something that should be done and more in each of the communities? Should police reach out to the population to try to build and strengthen these bridges?
I think so that the idea is that instead of reactive, because that's what I've been hearing a lot, is that it is a culture of reactivity rather than, I guess, getting to know each other. And it's a complex question.
Yeah, well, if I may reply to that, I think that you're absolutely right in your thinking, right? That there needs to be relationship, and I know Ron, we all just got through talking about it. You know, that if there's this relationship and there's this mutuality amongst us, and you know, the police see young Black and brown youth as they see their own children, then I think they will definitely you know, see increase and better relationships amongst the law enforcement and the community. One of the things that I'm always a proponent of, before I was here in New Jersey, I was in Oklahoma and I was fighting down there, is that there ought to, I believe strongly that there ought to be a residency requirement, right, for police. And that because if we live in the same neighborhood, if our wives at the same hairdresser and shopping at the same grocery store, if our kids in the same school and attending the same summer camp, if we're working out at the same gym, you get to know me as a person and I get to know you, and it breaks down the walls of fear that that occur with so many people in so many encounters. I've seen both from young and from old, you know, encounters whether with law enforcement from both our youth and from our older you know, Black men, that Black men especially, but also young Black women that that are just purely driven out of fear and a misunderstanding of the other, right? Black folk, just in case you don't know, we are loud and excited people. We like to, you know, when we get passionate about something, we're going, and we are no threat to anybody. That's just who we are. Our hands get to going, and you know, our voice gets elevated. We're not a threat. That's just who we are and how we express ourselves. But to law enforcement that does not know us as a culture and as a people, that is a complete threat to them, right? And they act accordingly. And I also want to say that, you know, law enforcement has to realize that the relationship with the youth also includes a relationship with the parents, right? And you know, that you are impacting, that if you, just like, his name is Rashad in Atlanta, his name is escaping me, that, you know, was just murdered by the cops in Atlanta a week or so ago, that I believe they're funeralizing today, that you not only took his life, but you also now robbed the life of his daughter and his fiance or his wife and you know, and his family. And so realizing that in the same way that, you know, that law enforcement wants to go home, so does most of the people, 98% of the people that they encounter, if not 99%. And they can't approach the 99% with the same, you know, veracity and fear and you know, just aggressiveness as they do the 1% who may not want to go home or who may not want them to go home. And so really, I think it's all about relationship. Again, it's about love. It's about respect. It's about seeing the God in each other. And when we do that, and we love our neighbors, we love ourselves, then I sincerely believe that there'll be greater relationships all around.
I apologize for interrupting for just a second. For example, we're going to be having an open forum with our police department. In what way do you think I might approach the police department, whoever's there, sheriffs, and talk to them about that?
Yeah, I would say increase training and, you know, increase training, in-person diversity training and the frequency of it, right? I think Right now, at least in Monmouth County, they only have to train by video, and they answer a couple questions, you know, and that's it, right? It is completely inadequate. And so in-person frequent training is definitely necessary, where they can, and cultural diversity training, where they can understand the other. And I think anti-bias, I know there's another pastor, Lydell Akins, who does some of this training, but to offer more, you know, Mark Klein would be a great person to have come in and do some training in that way, that, and, you know, and also hiring practices, right? To, and we talked about this before, you know, that they, and let me say also the training of the policeman just to become a policeman, that if a policeman is not able to police without a weapon, then they should not be a police. And so, you know, injecting in the training time to where they have to serve in jail, where they have to, you know, be guards in the jail system, where they cannot take a weapon. Because again, if a policeman cannot fight, they're automatically going to draw their weapon, right? If they're scared and they are, I'm going to quote somebody else, if the police are punks, then they're automatically going, they're more likely to take somebody's life and grab their weapon than they are to, you know, to try and protect and serve or de-escalate a situation. So definitely training in all those practices and more frequently. Thanks.
So here's the reality. I want to be respectful of time because we're over. There are a lot of questions that Dan's received. What I'd like to do is we maybe take one or two more, but then I want to promise that every question will get answered. I will circulate them to the panel, and Dan has all of the contact information from everyone that's registered. And so we will make sure that all answers are given, and so we can't do it all here right now. So Dan, if you want to.
Yeah. So the good news is the next three or so from Beth, from Grace, they're all kind of the same question, more or less. Each one of you know, each one of us here has some kind of a strength or skill, or is driven by some kind of ideology. The general question is, what's next? What can people do to contribute to making the community a better community? What's next as far as the conversation between the Jewish and Black community, or just the Black and white community? What is the next step that the members of this panel see, the next step that can really start making a difference, at least in our small corner of the world?
Well, I can start just by saying.
I consolidated about 5 questions here. So.
Yeah, education is huge. That's what we're doing here. We'll have some more of these with diverse voices from the rabbinate. We have, you know, an abundance of colleagues, male, female, from every walk of the tradition that have experience to share, and I think that's important. And the same thing in terms of every community. Last time we were together, Reverend Nicole Harris was with us. You know, so there are those aspects that we need to get. It's not a monolithic question, but we need to educate and be with each other. And then we need to stop showing up at events and start showing up with each other. And as you know, we're all live streaming services. We can chime into anybody's worship experience and get a flavor of that. And we get to come back together. We can actually show up with each other. But like what Keshia's doing, you know, we can all talk to about trying to create a community for tiny houses and farms at Fort Monmouth and some of the other areas that are laying fallow. So my answer is it's about showing up, and we'll facilitate more and more of these opportunities. But people need to say, I need to learn, I need to grow, and I need to be there. In Hebrew, that word is hineni. Here I am, and I'm ready to serve. Ron?
I think another thing in addition to that is, in your communities, if you see something not right, speak up. Don't take it personal. Don't say, I don't want to get involved. That's not my fight. That's what has been going on for so long, is it's not been others' fight. And while I know Kerwin said we can take more responsibility, we need support as that responsibility is taken. And so when you see things unjustly happen, when you see people ignored, something as simple as in the grocery store, and a person may be ahead of you, but they go to you first because of whatever implicit bias that they have. If you see something happening and you know it's not right, to speak up. And also when there are issues that need to be spoke about, help support or speak up on those issues, so that it's not just for the individual, but the whole community as a whole.
You know, we've seen the pledge to stand up for each other. Dr. Ali Chaudhry and I and several others took to the State House, and we've taken to communities all around. Effectively, the pledge is that when I see or hear someone of my own ethnicity or my own group speak badly about someone else, I will stand up and address it right then. Because it's a human problem. It's not a black problem, a white problem, a Jewish problem, or whatever. It's a human problem. And so, Ryan, I think you're absolutely right. Because if we don't speak up, then everybody around says, well, everybody agreed with me, so it must be okay. So, but that's part of being uncomfortable. So I guess I'm going to say thank you, everybody. Dan is going to get me the questions that are out there, and we will make sure they get answered. Susan, thank you. Do you have anything you want to say to wrap us up?
Appreciate everybody joining, and thank you to the panelists, and thank you, Mark, for making this happen. And I look forward to continuing the conversations, learning more about each other. And as you said, Ron, standing up for each other. So be well, everybody. Be safe.
Thank you.
Be healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Be well and have a week of healing and a week of joy that we share with each other.
Thank you, everybody. And you can just reply and to the emails you got from me, and continue to ask questions. And I'm happy to pass it on to the others.
Thanks. Be well, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. All right, take care.
Thank you.
Bye.